Hey there, AP Macro students. This is Mr. Sanabria, and today we need to talk about T accounts and fractional reserve banking and how to actually do the work. Last time in class we talked about exactly how to draw a T account, and I gave you the working version. And today what I want to do is I want to tell you the process that you want to go through in order to do some of the work of working with T accounts. So let's just go ahead and begin. What I want to start with is kind of reviewing what our working T account is supposed to look like. And what we're going to do here is I brought my whiteboard over, no slides, it's all going to be whiteboard work. So let me just adjust my video here so that you can see the board, and let's get started. What you want to have is assets and liabilities, and what you want is for them to equal each other. Okay, so assets should equal liabilities, and the reason we call this a T account is because it's shaped like a T, right? Let me see if I can work with the glare here just a little bit. There we go. So assets have to equal liabilities, and the main liabilities that we're concerned with is what's known as demand deposits, and this is the amount of money deposited into the bank. So demand deposits. Now for our working version, I want a category that I'm going to call new demand deposits. So I just put an NDD there. So new demand deposits. Now that's all that's over here on liabilities for us. Where a lot of the action is going to be is on the asset side. So the assets that a bank has, the stuff that they're going to basically be able to use to make money, is reserves. So you have the required reserves and you have the excess reserves. Both of these are reserves. Okay, so in general, these are both reserves. But we care about which ones are required, which ones are excess. The next thing is an L for loans, because banks want to make loans so that they can make money. And then finally, we have bonds. B is for bonds. Now, there is this process of money creation through making loans that we talked about last time, whereby when a bank makes a loan, they actually create money. When you go to the bank and you ask for a loan, and you're approved, and the bank says, yes, we will give you a loan, what they do is, instead of just giving you a big bag full of money, they actually open an account with that bank, and they deposit money into it. So what you end up with whenever you go to the bank and you get a loan is you get a new demand deposit. Like in that bank, there are new demand deposits, and that's what this new demand deposit category stands for. It's loans that have been created by the bank. Keep in mind that as we go through this, everything that happens over here has an impact over here and vice versa. Okay, these two sides have to balance each other. So let's just dive right into an example of the kind of work that you might have to do. The first thing that you want to know, no matter what is the required reserve ratio. So let me bring this over here. Step one always is, what is the required reserve ratio? So you want to identify the required reserve ratio, and through that, we're going to come up with something called the money multiplier. Okay? And the money multiplier is simply how much money is going to be created by the bank through making loans. Now, I told you before that, and this is a little while ago, but the spending multiplier is just like this. Whenever we were learning the spending multiplier, I said, hey, in the future, we're going to do something called fractional reserve banking. So I'm going to talk for a while. Let me show you my face there. So we're going to talk about fractional reserve banking. We're going to use a concept very similar to the spending multiplier. And the spending multiplier equation, if you may recall, is 1 over MPS, right? Let's put that here, 1 over MPS, so that you can see it. Because this is 1 over a household's marginal propensity to save. Well, the money multiplier is very similar to this. Instead of the marginal propensity to save, it's the bank's propensity to save. You can think of it that way. And what is the bank's propensity to save. It's actually the required reserve ratio. So the equation for the money multiplier is 1 over the required reserve ratio. And so it's really easy. So I've already explained, and you already know, that the required reserve ratio generally is 10%, right? So to apply the equation, 1 over 0.01 equals 10. So if the money multiplier is 10%, or I'm sorry, if the required reserve ratio is 10%, the money multiplier is 10. Let's give an example, and I'm going to switch to blue because I think you can see that better. Let's give an example that's not 10%, just to make sure we understand this. What if the required reserve ratio was 20%? 1 over 0.02, right? Which equals 5. Now your money multiplier would be 5. So your first step, no matter what you're doing in a T account problem, is to determine what is, now going back to the board, what is the required reserve ratio, and then you use that to tell yourself what the money multiplier is. So, in this problem, let's assume a required reserve ratio of 10%. What does that make our money multiplier? 10. Okay, but we don't know what to do with that yet. So what we want to do now is figure out what kind of change we're talking about. What can change here? Well, what if somebody comes along and deposits $100 into this bank? So you put $100 into deposits. Okay? So let me thicken that up. $100 goes into deposits. What's the first thing that has to happen? The golden rule of banking. You have to balance this. It needs to equal itself, and you need to keep in reserve 10%. So, $10 goes into required reserves. How much is left over? $90. And that's excess reserves. So here we go. This is balanced. And when I've said that a few times now, this is what I mean. The assets column equals the liabilities. There's $100 on both sides. But is the bank just going to sit there with $90 in excess reserves? No. What they would like to do is lend that money out. So they can lend out $90. And I just told you, when a bank makes a loan, it actually makes a demand deposit. So that's $90 that goes right here. But wait, we're no longer balanced. There's 190 on this side. There's only 100 on this side. So you've got to have $19 in required reserves. You've got a $90 loan. So are we balanced yet? No. There's right now $109 on assets, and there's 190. So the difference is what? 81. So now we have a balanced T account. But look at the situation. The bank can now make a loan of $81. And so they do. And that would set off the whole chain reaction once again. Now they're going to have $171. There's going to be a new $81 over here. We could add it all up. We could balance it again. And that's a lot of work, and that's not what we're going to do. We're going to skip all of that. And that's what the money multiplier allows us to do. So step 2 is apply the change and balance the T account. Okay? Apply the change and balance the T account. So if in our scenario, the change is somebody from off the street deposits $100, you apply the change and you balance. That's it. We balanced, right? I applied the $100 in demand deposits, and then I balanced it up. Now, step 3, instead of starting to go round and round with bank creates this much loans, and then it's over here, and then I balance again, and create more loans, I balance again. Instead of doing that, we simply multiply the change in excess reserves times the money multiplier. That's a very important part here. The change in excess reserves times the money multiplier. In the example we're working through, what's the change of excess reserves? It went from being 0 to now being 90. The change in excess reserves is 90. What's our money multiplier? It's 10. So, for us, that looks like 90 times 10, which is 900. Okay, what do we do with that now? What do we do with that 900? Well, first off, excess reserves goes away. $900 is how many loans can be made. How many loans are made is the same as your new demand deposits, so that's that new demand deposits category. These are demand deposits from loans. Okay, so $900 in loans, demand deposits from loans. Are we balanced? No. There's now $1,000 over here, and there's only $910 over here. Also, there's $1,000 in demand deposits, but only $10 in the required reserves. That's not going to cut it. There needs to be $100 in required reserves. Now are we balanced? Actually, we are. That was easy. There's now $1,000 on each side, and we know the answer to some critical questions. How many demand deposits were created through loans? 900. How much money was created from the $100 deposit? 900. How many, what was the change in required reserves based on the total change? Well, it's 100 because there were no required reserves before, now there's 100. There's kind of a lot of questions that could be asked. Okay? But this is what we want to do. Now, that makes step 4. Applying the answer here to loans, rebalance, and answer questions. So, I don't know if you can see that. That just says rebalance and answer questions. Okay? So let's try one example that is not as easy as this, but it's still pretty simple. What happens if we start off with our T account and for some reason there is already some information? We've got $1,000 in bonds. Well, first off, there needs to somehow be $1,000 over here. And I will tell you, sometimes you'll see that over here and sometimes you won't. If you don't see it, don't worry about it. It's probably those other categories that we're not worried about, owner's equity and stuff like that. So let's say you have $1,000 here just to start. That's fine. Maybe they don't show you anything here, but they say the Fed wants to pursue an expansionary the Fed here, right? So an expansionary monetary policy, and they want to do open market operations. So expansionary open market operations is what? Buying bonds. Buy big, right? So if the Fed buys this $1,000 worth of bonds, what does that look like? Well, if the Fed buys that $1,000 worth of bonds, it no longer exists, right? Bonds are now zero. But where does that money go? Because the bank didn't give the bonds away for free, they got $1,000 for them. That $1,000 goes directly into excess reserves. Notice in this situation, there has not been a change in required reserves. The bank had assets and they simply liquidated them. It went from being $1,000 worth of bonds to now $1,000 in excess reserves. So, in thinking about our steps, apply and balance, we've done that. We need to multiply the change in excess reserves times the money multiplier. So what was the change in excess reserves? Well, it went from 0 to being 1,000, right? So we're going to multiply 1,000 by 10, and that's 10,000. There's no more excess reserves. They go away. They've all been loaned out. Where did that 10,000 go? Well, it's demand deposits from loans. Okay, so we're not balanced here though, right? And here's the problem with doing an open market operation question. If you're not given a complete T account, which in this case we weren't, right? You might think, well, there needs to be $1,000 in required reserves, and you're not wrong about that. But then you're thinking to yourself, well, this isn't balanced now because now there's 11,000 over here, there's only 10,000 over here. What you're not seeing are those extra categories like owner's equity and stuff like that. So if you ever run into this, don't fret too much about it. Just understand that there is still a required reserve here of 1,000, and we have also created a $10,000 worth of loans. There's now $10,000 worth of new demand deposits. What kind of questions can be asked here? Well, how much money was created as a result of the open market operation? $10,000. How many loans are, let me put this way. How much could the bank increase its loans by based on the open market operation? $10,000. Based only on the open market operation, how did required reserves change? You might want to say $1,000. No, because required reserves didn't change at all, actually. Required reserves based on only the open market purchase, nothing happened here. Nothing happened here until that money was loaned out. There's new demand deposits, and now we have that over there. So that is a couple of examples of going through the kind of work we're going to do. Take a moment real quick to make sure that you have these steps. Oh, that's a horrible sound. Make sure you have these steps in your notes because you're going to need to refer to these steps in order to do the practice problems that I've got for you. Step 1, identify the required reserve ratio and the money multiplier. Step 2, apply the change and balance the T account. Whether that change is the Fed buys bonds, whether that change is somebody comes along and deposits money. Step 3, multiply the change in excess reserves by the money multiplier. Okay. And step 4, rebalance and answer questions. Okay. Good luck, and we'll see how it goes. As always, happy studying.